On the morning of October 16, 1962, as President Kennedy reviewed reconnaissance photographs of Soviet missile installations in Cuba, a journeyman electrician named Thomas Bennett was kneeling in the crawl space beneath a nondescript office building in Washington, District of Columbia, wondering why someone had run coaxial cable through a residential junction box. He assumed it was a mistake, perhaps an apprentice's careless work. He had no idea he was about to stumble into one of the most elaborate Soviet espionage operations ever conducted on American soil. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Thomas Bennett was 34 years old that autumn, a veteran of the Korean War who had learned his trade through the GI Bill at a technical school in Baltimore. The war had marked him in ways both visible and invisible. A scar ran along his left forearm where shrapnel had torn through during the fighting near the Chosin Reservoir, a permanent reminder of the bitter cold and desperate combat that had defined those winter months of 1950. He had returned home in 1953 with a Bronze Star, nightmares that gradually faded, and a determination to build a quiet, normal life far from the chaos of combat. He wore his dark hair in the style of the day, slicked back with Brill cream, and kept his work shirts pressed, even when he knew they would be covered in dust and wire shavings by lunchtime. His wife Margaret often teased him about this fastidiousness, calling him her soldier boy who could not quite let go of military discipline. But Thomas believed that looking professional was half the battle in a competitive trade, especially for a man who had started his career later than most, using government benefits to attend Baltimore Technical Institute when he was already 26 years old. Margaret understood her husband better than he sometimes understood himself. She had met him at a church social in 1954, when Thomas was still adjusting to civilian life and working long hours to establish himself in his chosen profession. She had seen past his reserved demeanor to the intelligence and integrity beneath, had recognized in him a man who took his responsibilities seriously and who would be steadfast in both work and family. They had married in 1955, bought a modest house in Arlington, Virginia, and had 2 children, Daniel and Susan, who were now 6 and 4 years old respectively. Thomas worked for Potomac Electric Services, a mid-sized contractor that handled everything from residential rewiring to commercial installations across the district. The company had been founded in the 1930s by 2 brothers, both electrical engineers who had helped wire some of the New Deal government buildings. Now, in the 1960s, Potomac Electric had a solid reputation and a steady stream of contracts from both private clients and government agencies. Thomas had joined the company in 1956 and had worked his way up from apprentice to journeyman, earning respect for his careful work and his ability to solve complex electrical problems. The building where Thomas found himself that Tuesday morning stood on a quiet street in the Dupont Circle neighborhood, a 4-story structure of red brick that dated back to the 1920s. The facade showed its age in ways both charming and concerning. Ornate stonework framed the windows, carved in the classical style that had been fashionable in the prosperous years before the Great Depression. But the mortar between the bricks had begun to crumble in places, and water damage had left dark streaks down the walls where gutters had failed and been imperfectly repaired. The owner, a silver-haired lawyer named Arthur Hensley, had hired Potomac Electric to modernize the electrical system on the ground floor, where he kept his private practice. Hensley had purchased the building 3 years earlier when he left a large firm to establish his own office, specializing in estate planning and real estate law. The building had been affordable precisely because it needed extensive repairs, and Hensley had been working his way through them methodically as his practice grew and finances allowed. Thomas had been assigned the job specifically because of his reputation for thoroughness and his security clearance, a holdover from his military days that his employer found useful for government-adjacent work. The security clearance, though it had lapsed to inactive status, still carried weight in a city where government contracts often required background checks and verification. His supervisor at Potomac Electric, a gruff man named Walter Simmons, who had himself served in World War II, trusted Thomas with sensitive jobs that required discretion. The crawl space smelled of decades-old dust and mouse droppings, with an underlying note of decay from moisture that had seeped through the foundation over the years. Thomas moved carefully between the floor joists, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, tracing the path of outdated knob and tube wiring that needed replacement. This type of wiring, common in buildings from the 1920s, consisted of ceramic knobs that held wires away from wooden framing and ceramic tubes that protected wires passing through joists. It had been adequate for the electrical demands of its era, but by 1962 it was dangerously obsolete, unable to handle modern appliances and prone to creating fire hazards. He was mapping the existing system, making detailed sketches in his notebook of every junction and connection, when his light fell upon something that made him pause. A thick bundle of cables ran along the ceiling joists in a configuration that made no sense for the building's layout. The cables were relatively new, their insulation still supple and free of the cracks and brittleness that marked older installations. More curious still, they ran perpendicular to the main electrical feeds, heading not toward the meter box or circuit breakers, but toward the north wall of the building, toward the apartment complex next door. Thomas shifted his weight, moving closer to examine the cables. His knees pressed into the cold concrete floor and he could feel the damp seeping through his canvas work pants. There were 6 of them, each about the diameter of his thumb, sheathed in grey rubber insulation of a type he recognized as commercial grade, far superior to standard residential wiring. The installation was professional, far better than the sloppy work he usually encountered in old buildings. Whoever had run these lines knew what they were doing, had the right tools, and had taken the time to do the job properly. The cables were secured to the joists with professional cable clamps at regular intervals, exactly the sort of careful spacing that building codes required, but that corner-cutting electricians often ignored. Thomas ran his hand along one of the cables, feeling the quality of the insulation, noting how it had been carefully routed to avoid sharp edges that might damage the sheathing over time. This was the work of someone who understood that installations had to last, someone who could not afford to have a cable failure lead to discovery. The cables disappeared into a hole that had been drilled through the foundation wall, a hole that Thomas could tell had been recently patched with fresh mortar around the cable entry point. The mortar was still lighter in color than the surrounding concrete, probably no more than a few months old. Thomas pulled a small folding rule from his pocket and measured the hole. It was precisely 8 inches in diameter, which meant someone had used a core drill with a diamond bit, expensive equipment that required both skill and strength to operate. The edges of the hole were clean and smooth, none of the rough chipping that would result from using a hammer drill or trying to enlarge a smaller hole. He examined the mortar seal more closely, shining his flashlight at an angle to see the texture. The work was neat and professional, with the mortar smoothly troweled to match the surrounding concrete as closely as possible. Someone had even added concrete dust to the mix to better approximate the color of the aged foundation. This was not the work of an amateur or a casual installation. This was the work of someone who understood that details mattered, that even small discrepancies might attract unwanted attention. He pulled out his notebook and made a quick sketch of the cable routing, more out of habit than concern. In his experience, strange wiring usually had a mundane explanation. Perhaps the previous owner had shared an electrical service with the building next door. Perhaps someone had installed an unauthorized connection to save money on their power bill. Still, something about the professionalism of the installation nagged at him. This was not the work of a homeowner trying to save a few dollars. Thomas continued his survey, but his mind kept returning to those cables. After an hour of mapping the rest of the system, he climbed out of the crawl space and brushed the dust from his coveralls. Arthur Hensley was in his office, reviewing legal documents at a heavy mahogany desk that dominated the small room. "Mr. Hensley," Thomas said, standing in the doorway, "I found something odd down there. There are cables running through your crawl space that do not connect to your electrical system. They go through the foundation wall into the building next door." Hensley looked up from his papers, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Cables? What sort of cables? Thomas described what he had found. Heavy gauge, professionally installed, recent work. 6 of them, maybe for telephone or data transmission. "Do you know anything about them?" The lawyer frowned and shook his head. I bought this building 3 years ago. The previous owner was a dentist who retired to Florida. As far as I know, there have been no special installations. Have you checked with the people next door? Not yet, Thomas said. I wanted to ask you first. Hensley stood and moved to the window, looking out at the street below. The building next door, he said quietly, is owned by a holding company. I have never met the occupants. The windows are always covered, and I rarely see anyone coming or going. To be honest, I always assumed it was vacant or perhaps used for storage. Thomas felt a small prick of unease in his chest. The building next door had always seemed unnaturally quiet for a structure its size. He had noticed it during his initial survey of the job site, but had not thought much of it at the time. Now, standing in Hensley's office with the autumn sun slanting through the windows, he found himself wondering what kind of operation required 6 heavy cables and valued privacy so highly. I will need to inspect those cables more thoroughly, Thomas said. With your permission, I would like to trace them to see where they terminate. Hensley nodded slowly. Do what you need to do. But be discreet. I do not want trouble with the neighbors, whoever they are. Thomas spent the rest of the morning in the crawl space, this time with additional tools and a more specific purpose. He followed the cables to the foundation wall and examined the penetration point carefully. The hole through the concrete was precisely drilled, the diameter exactly matching the cable bundle. This was not casual work. Someone had used a core drill, expensive equipment that required skill to operate. The mortar seal around the cables was neat and professional. He tried to pull gently on one of the cables to test its connection, but they were firmly secured on both sides of the wall. Using a continuity tester, he confirmed that the cables were not carrying electrical power. The resistance reading suggested they were coaxial cables, the type used for radio frequency transmission or high-quality audio. This deepened the mystery. Why would someone need 6 coaxial cables running from one building to another? When Thomas emerged from the crawl space for lunch, he found Hensley waiting for him with an anxious expression. I made some calls, the lawyer said. The building next door is registered to a company called Baltic Import Associates. I looked them up. They claim to be importers of European textiles and crafts. However, when I called their office number, I got a recording saying they were closed for renovations. Thomas wiped his hands on a rag, thinking, Baltic Import Associates. The name had a vaguely Eastern European flavor to it. In 1962, with tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union reaching a fever pitch over Cuba, anything connected to Eastern Europe warranted caution. Mr. Hensley, Thomas said carefully, I think we should report this to someone. Those cables are too sophisticated to be for anything ordinary, and if the building next door is supposed to be closed, why would they need 6 high-capacity communication lines running into your property? The lawyer was quiet for a moment, then nodded. I know someone at the FBI. We served together during the war. Let me make a call. 2 hours later, Thomas found himself sitting in a small conference room at the FBI Washington field office on Pennsylvania Avenue, describing what he had found to 2 special agents. The building itself was imposing, a fortress of bureaucracy and law enforcement that made Thomas feel simultaneously secure and intimidated. He had passed through multiple security checkpoints to reach this room, each guard carefully examining his identification and checking his name against a list before allowing him to proceed. The younger agent, whose name was David Foster, took detailed notes in a small leather-bound notebook, his pen moving rapidly across the page in what appeared to be some form of shorthand. Foster was perhaps 28 years old, clean-cut in the FBI manner, with alert eyes that seemed to catalogue everything about Thomas, from his work-worn hands to the dust still clinging to his coveralls, despite his attempt to brush clean before the meeting. The older agent, Martin Crawford, asked questions in a measured, careful tone that suggested he had conducted many such interviews and knew exactly how to extract information without making a witness feel interrogated. Crawford was in his mid-40s, his dark suit impeccably pressed, his tie knotted with military precision. There was a quality of patient intensity about him that reminded Thomas of intelligence officers he had encountered in Korea, men who understood that wars could be won or lost based on fragments of information properly analyzed. These cables, Crawford said, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, his hands clasped together. "You said they were professionally installed. Could you estimate when?" "Based on the mortar," Thomas replied, choosing his words carefully, "I would say within the last 6 months. Maybe as recently as 3 or 4 months ago." The concrete dust around the hole had not been completely cleaned away, and the mortar had not yet developed the same patina as the older sections of the foundation. "The color difference is subtle, but once you know what to look for, it is obvious." Crawford nodded slowly. "And the quality of the installation? You said it was professional. Can you be more specific about what you mean by that?" Thomas thought about how to explain it to someone who had never worked in his trade. The cables are secured with proper clamps at regular intervals. The routing avoids sharp corners that might damage the insulation. The hole through the foundation is precisely drilled with what must have been an 8-inch core bit, probably diamond-tipped. That kind of equipment costs hundreds of dollars and requires real skill to use. This was not someone's cousin doing a favor. This was a professional installation, probably by someone with formal training in electrical or telecommunications work. Crawford and Foster exchanged glances. "And the building next door," Foster said. "You said the windows are always covered." Thomas nodded. "I did a walk around the block during lunch. Every window has heavy curtains or blinds. No signs of activity. The front door is solid steel with multiple locks. There is no business sign. Nothing to indicate what Baltic Import Associates actually does." Crawford stood and walked to the window of the conference room, looking out at the street below. "Mr. Bennett," he said without turning around, "you may have stumbled into something significant. We have been aware of Baltic Import Associates for some time. They are suspected of being a front for Soviet intelligence operations, but we have not had enough evidence to secure a warrant. These cables you have found might give us the probable cause we need." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. "Soviet intelligence? You mean, like spies?" Crawford turned back to face him. "The FBI has been tracking Soviet espionage activities in Washington for years. The Soviets are very good at what they do. They establish legitimate-looking businesses, they blend into neighborhoods, and they conduct their operations with great care. If they have gone to the trouble of running cables into Mr. Hensley's building, they have a specific purpose in mind." "What kind of purpose?" Thomas asked. "That is what we need to determine," Foster said. "But based on what you have described, those coaxial cables are almost certainly being used for some kind of signals intelligence operation. They could be monitoring radio frequencies, intercepting telephone conversations, or recording audio from listening devices planted elsewhere in the city." Thomas thought about this. The DuPont Circle neighborhood was home to numerous government buildings, embassies and offices of political organizations. It would be an ideal location for an espionage listening post. The realization that he had been working just feet away from such an operation made his skin prickle. "What happens now?" Thomas asked. Crawford sat down again, fixing Thomas with a steady gaze. "Now, Mr. Bennett, we are going to ask for your help. We need to confirm what is on the other side of that wall, and we need to do it without alerting the Soviets that we are onto them. We cannot simply knock on their door and demand to see the premises. That would give them time to destroy evidence and shut down their operation. We need to be more subtle." Thomas felt a surge of apprehension. "What do you want me to do?" "We want you to finish your electrical work at Mr. Hensley's building," Foster said. "But while you are in that crawl space, we want you to install some monitoring equipment for us. Small devices that will allow us to listen to what is happening on the other side of that wall. Can you do that?" Thomas took a deep breath. He had not expected his workday to take this turn. The thought of deliberately engaging in espionage, even against Soviet spies, was daunting. But he also felt a sense of duty. He had served his country in Korea, had seen friends die fighting against communist forces. If the Soviets were operating in his city, conducting intelligence activities that could threaten American security, he wanted to help stop them. "I can do it," Thomas said. "Tell me what you need." Over the next 3 days, Thomas Bennett became an unlikely spy. The FBI provided him with specialized equipment, small contact microphones that could be attached to pipes or structural elements to pick up vibrations and convert them into audible sound. The devices were surprisingly sophisticated for their time, each about the size of a silver dollar, housed in black metal casings with threaded mounting studs that could be screwed into prepared brackets. Foster gave him a crash course in how to install the devices and how to test them to ensure they were working properly. The training session took place in a workshop in the basement of the FBI building, a space filled with electronic equipment and tools that Thomas recognized, and many he did not. Foster demonstrated how to attach the contact microphones to different types of surfaces, explaining that metal pipes and structural steel were particularly good conductors of sound vibration. He showed Thomas how to orient the devices for maximum sensitivity and how to test them using a small handheld meter that measured the electrical signal they produced. Thomas practiced on sample installations until Foster was satisfied with his technique. The work was not vastly different from the precision electrical installations Thomas performed regularly, but the context gave it an entirely different character. Instead of connecting wires to provide power or communication, he was installing devices that would secretly listen to an adversary. The moral implications of this work troubled Thomas less than he might have expected. His experiences in Korea had taught him that sometimes survival required actions that peacetime morality might question. The equipment was crude by later standards, but in 1962, it represented the cutting edge of surveillance technology. The contact microphones had been developed by Bell Laboratories, working with government contracts, refined through years of trial and error to maximize sensitivity while minimizing size. The recording equipment that would receive their signals was similarly advanced, using magnetic tape systems that could run for hours unattended, capturing everything the microphones detected. Thomas returned to the Hensley building each morning with his usual tools, but now he also carried a small canvas bag containing the FBI's listening devices. The bag looked exactly like the tool bags other electricians carried, unremarkable enough to avoid attracting attention. He told Hensley what was happening, swearing the lawyer to secrecy. Hensley, whose wartime service had included work in military intelligence analyzing intercepted German communications, understood the gravity of the situation and gave his full cooperation. In fact, Hensley seemed energized by the opportunity to contribute to national security again, offering suggestions about the best ways to maintain the cover of normal electrical work. The lawyer insisted on being present in the building during Thomas's work, providing a natural explanation for anyone who might be watching. He would arrive each morning at his usual time, unlock the front door, and proceed to his office, where he would genuinely work on legal documents while Thomas operated in the crawl space below. If anyone from the building next door happened to observe the activity, they would see only a lawyer and an electrician engaged in perfectly routine building maintenance. The first device Thomas installed was a contact microphone attached to a water pipe that ran through the wall into the building next door. The installation was delicate work. He had to attach the device securely enough that it would not fall off, but gently enough that he did not create vibrations that might alert anyone listening on the other side. His hands shook slightly as he worked, acutely aware that if the Soviets discovered what he was doing, he could be placing himself in danger. The second device went on a steam pipe that ran parallel to the coaxial cables. Thomas used epoxy to secure it, then carefully ran a thin wire back to a junction box where the FBI would later install their recording equipment. The work required him to spend hours in the cramped, dusty crawl space, his muscles cramping and his nerves stretched taut with tension. On the third day, as Thomas was installing the final monitoring device, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices, faint but distinct, coming through the wall. They were speaking Russian. Thomas did not understand the language, but the cadence and intonation were unmistakable. He had heard enough Russian during his service in Korea, from prisoners and from intelligence briefings about Soviet involvement in the war, to recognize it immediately. He froze in place, barely breathing, his hand still holding the contact microphone he had been about to attach to a steam pipe. The voices were muffled by the foundation wall, but clear enough that he could tell there were at least two speakers, maybe three. One voice was deeper, older sounding, speaking in what seemed like a tone of authority. The other voices responded more briefly, as if receiving instructions or answering questions. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest as he listened. The conversation seemed to be discussing technical specifications, numbers and frequencies that meant nothing to him, but which he tried desperately to memorize for his report to the FBI. He heard one voice say something that sounded like 30 megahertz, and another respond with what might have been measurements or coordinates. The clinical, matter-of-fact tone of the discussion made it clear that this was routine business, professionals at work. The crawl space suddenly felt smaller, more confining. Thomas was acutely aware that only a wall of concrete and brick separated him from Soviet intelligence operatives. If they knew he was there, if they suspected what he was doing, he could be in serious danger. The FBI had assured him that the Soviets would have no reason to suspect his presence, that routine electrical work was too common to raise alarms. But hearing those voices made the theoretical danger feel very real. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, the voices moved away and silence returned. Thomas realized he had been holding his breath and let it out slowly, trying to calm his racing pulse. His hands were shaking as he resumed work on the contact microphone, carefully positioning it on the steam pipe and securing it with the epoxy compound Foster had provided. The work required steady hands, and Thomas had to pause several times to let his nerves settle before he could complete the installation properly. When he finally finished and climbed out of the crawl space as quickly as he could without making noise, his shirt was soaked with sweat, despite the cool October air. He brushed himself off, trying to appear calm and professional, but his mind was racing. He needed to report what he had heard, but he did not want to use the telephone in Hensley's office. The FBI had warned him that the Soviets might have the capability to monitor local telephone lines, and while calling the FBI directly would probably not raise suspicions, Thomas decided to take no chances. He went directly to a payphone 2 blocks away and called the number Foster had given him. "I heard them," Thomas said when Foster answered. "They are definitely in there. Russian speakers. At least 2 of them, maybe more." "Good work," Foster said. "Stay calm. We are going to move soon. In the meantime, finish the electrical work as planned. We do not want anything to seem unusual." The following week, the FBI installed recording equipment in Hensley's building, running wires from Thomas's monitoring devices to a receiver hidden in a storage closet. A rotating team of agents monitored the listening post around the clock, documenting everything they heard from the building next door. What they discovered confirmed their worst suspicions. Baltic Import Associates was indeed a Soviet intelligence operation, but not just any operation. The listening post was part of a sophisticated network designed to intercept communications from multiple government agencies. The 6 coaxial cables Thomas had found were connected to rooftop antennas, concealed behind false chimneys and ventilation structures. These antennas were positioned to pick up radio transmissions from government buildings, embassy radio rooms, and even military installations on the outskirts of Washington. The Soviets had chosen their location with great care. The building's position and elevation gave them clear line of sight to numerous sensitive facilities. They were not just listening to random radio traffic. They were systematically monitoring secure communications channels, using sophisticated receivers and recording equipment to capture and analyze American military and diplomatic radio traffic. The FBI's surveillance of the listening post lasted 3 weeks. During that time, agents documented the identities of the Soviet operatives working there, tracked their communications with handlers at the Soviet embassy, and gathered evidence of their intelligence-gathering activities. The information was passed to the State Department and to military intelligence, where analysts worked to assess what secrets might have been compromised. Thomas continued his electrical work, finishing the installation at Hensley's building while the FBI operation unfolded around him. He found it surreal to go about his normal work, while knowing that just beyond the wall, Soviet spies were conducting operations that could affect national security. He said nothing to his wife or colleagues, maintaining the cover of an ordinary workman completing an ordinary job. On November 8, 1962, the FBI raided the Baltic Import Associates building. The timing was carefully coordinated to catch the operatives during their normal working hours, when the equipment would be active and evidence would be readily available. Thomas was not present for the raid, but Foster called him that evening to describe what they had found. The building was full of equipment, Foster said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. Radio receivers, recording devices, encryption machines. We found transcripts of intercepted communications, code books, Everything we needed to prove this was a major intelligence operation. We arrested 4 Soviet operatives and 1 American who was working with them. Will this be in the news? Thomas asked. Eventually, Foster replied, but not immediately. The State Department is negotiating with the Soviets about how to handle this diplomatically. They do not want to cause a major international incident while we are still dealing with the Cuban situation. But your name will be kept out of it entirely. As far as the world is concerned, this was the result of routine FBI surveillance. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Part of him wanted recognition for what he had done, but another part understood the necessity of secrecy. In the shadow world of espionage, victories were often silent and heroes remained anonymous. What will happen to the people you arrested? Thomas asked. The Soviets will be declared persona non grata and sent back to Moscow, Foster said. The American will face trial for espionage. But the real victory here is not the arrests. It is what we learned about their methods and capabilities. Thanks to your discovery, we now know what frequencies they were monitoring, what encryption methods they were trying to break, and how their collection network was structured. That intelligence is worth more than a dozen arrests. In the weeks that followed, Thomas returned to his normal life. He completed jobs for Potomac Electric, came home to Margaret and their 2 children, watched the evening news reports about the ongoing standoff over Cuba. He never told his wife about what had happened in the crawl space beneath the Hensley building, honoring the secrecy agreement he had signed with the FBI. But he carried the knowledge with him, a private understanding of how close the Cold War could come to home, how the great ideological struggle between superpowers could manifest in something as mundane as cables in a crawl space. Years later, after documents about the case were declassified, Thomas learned more about the operation he had helped disrupt. The Baltic Import Associates listening post had been operational for nearly 8 months before his discovery. During that time, the Soviets had intercepted thousands of radio transmissions, including classified military communications and diplomatic traffic, between the State Department and American embassies abroad. The intelligence they gathered had given Moscow insights into American military readiness, diplomatic strategies, and strategic planning during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. The cables Thomas had found were connected to what the FBI later described as one of the most sophisticated signals intelligence operations ever mounted by the Soviets on American soil. The listening post had been monitoring frequencies used by the Pentagon, the State Department, and several intelligence agencies. The Soviets had been using the intercepted information to anticipate American moves in the Cuban Missile Crisis and other Cold War confrontations. The American who had been arrested, a former signals intelligence specialist named Raymond Pierce, had provided the Soviets with detailed technical information about American radio communication systems. Pierce had worked at Fort Meade earlier in his career and had maintained contacts within the intelligence community. His betrayal had enabled the Soviets to fine-tune their listening equipment and focus on the most valuable communication channels. Pierce was convicted of espionage in 1963 and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. The 4 Soviet operatives were quietly expelled from the United States in a diplomatic arrangement that received little public attention. The Soviet government never acknowledged the listening post's existence, maintaining the fiction that Baltic Import Associates had been a legitimate import business. The building itself was eventually sold to a real estate developer and converted into apartments, with no marker or memorial to indicate its role in Cold War espionage. Thomas Bennett continued working as an electrician for another 25 years before retiring. He never spoke publicly about his role in discovering the listening post, even after the case was declassified. When reporters occasionally tracked him down for interviews, he politely declined, saying only that he had been doing his job and had reported something unusual to the proper authorities. In private, however, Thomas sometimes reflected on the strange turn his life had taken that October morning in 1962. He thought about how a simple electrical job had led him into the hidden world of espionage, how a few cables in a crawl space had revealed a major intelligence operation. He wondered what other secrets lay hidden in the buildings and basements of Washington, what other operations were unfolding in the shadows while ordinary people went about their daily lives. Margaret noticed that her husband had changed after that autumn. He was more cautious, more aware of his surroundings, quicker to notice things that seemed out of place. Sometimes, when they walked past government buildings or embassy compounds, Thomas would pause and look at the windows, the rooflines, the places where antennas might be hidden. He never explained these moments of distraction, and Margaret learned not to ask. The Cold War continued for another 3 decades after Thomas's discovery. The intelligence agencies of both superpowers continued their endless game of espionage and counter-espionage, planting bugs and finding them, recruiting spies and exposing them, building listening posts and shutting them down. The technology became more sophisticated, the methods more refined, but the fundamental contest remained the same, a struggle for information and advantage waged in the shadows. Thomas Bennett's contribution to that struggle was modest but significant. He had not infiltrated an enemy agency or stolen crucial documents. He had simply been observant enough to notice something unusual and responsible enough to report it. In the world of intelligence, such moments of ordinary vigilance could have extraordinary consequences. The discovery of the Baltic Import Associates listening post had immediate tactical value, ending a specific intelligence operation and exposing a network of Soviet operatives. But it also had broader strategic implications. The information the FBI gathered during their surveillance of the listening post provided insights into Soviet signals intelligence methods that influenced American communications security for years afterward. Military and diplomatic radio systems were redesigned to be more resistant to interception. New encryption methods were developed and deployed. Counterintelligence operations were refined based on lessons learned from the case. In the grand narrative of the Cold War, the story of an electrician finding strange wiring in a crawl space might seem like a small footnote. But such footnotes accumulated to form the larger text, moments of discovery and disruption that collectively shape the course of the conflict. Every listening post closed was a source of intelligence denied. Every spy network exposed was a capability degraded. Every instance of vigilance and reporting was a small victory in the long twilight struggle between the superpowers. Thomas understood this in a way that few civilians could. He had seen, quite literally, the hidden infrastructure of espionage, the cables and wires and electronic equipment that enabled one nation to spy on another. He knew that behind the public face of diplomatic relations and cultural exchanges, there existed another reality of covert operations and secret intelligence gathering. He knew that the Cold War was not just about missiles and armies, but also about information and the ability to keep secrets or steal them. As the years passed and the Cold War gradually wound down toward its unexpected conclusion in the collapse of the Soviet Union, Thomas sometimes wondered what had happened to the Soviet operatives who had worked in that building next to Hensley's law office. Had they been punished for the failure of their operation? Had they continued their intelligence careers in other postings? Had any of them ever known that their discovery had begun with an electrician's curiosity about misplaced cables? These questions had no answers, lost in the classified records and official silences that surrounded intelligence operations. But Thomas took a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he had played a role, however small, in protecting his country during a time of danger. He had been a journeyman electrician who happened to notice something wrong, who had the sense to report it, and who had the courage to help investigate it. In the complex machinery of national security, he had been one small part that functioned properly at a critical moment. The legacy of Thomas Bennett's discovery extended beyond the immediate case. The FBI used the Baltic Import Associates operation as a case study in training new counterintelligence agents, teaching them about Soviet technical collection methods and the importance of building inspections and physical security. The story of how a routine electrical job had uncovered a major listening post became part of the institutional knowledge of American counterintelligence, a reminder that vigilance could come from unexpected places and that the most ordinary citizens could contribute to national security. For Thomas himself, the experience reinforced lessons he had learned in Korea about duty and vigilance. He came to see his work differently afterward, not just as a trade, but as a position of responsibility. He trained the apprentices who worked with him to be observant, to notice things that did not fit, to ask questions when something seemed wrong. He never told them why these habits were important, but he impressed upon them the necessity of thoroughness and attention to detail. When Thomas retired in 1987, the Cold War was entering its final phase, though no one yet knew it. The Soviet Union would collapse within a few years, ending the great ideological conflict that had shaped his adult life. The listening posts and spy networks, the elaborate intelligence operations and counter-operations, all would become historical artifacts, subjects for books and documentaries, rather than active threats. But in October of 1962, when Thomas Bennett first knelt in that dusty crawl space and noticed cables that should not have been there, none of that future was visible. The world stood on the brink of nuclear war over Cuba. The Cold War seemed likely to continue indefinitely. And in the hidden spaces of cities and capitals, the silent struggle for information and advantage continued with an intensity that civilians rarely glimpsed. Thomas Bennett glimpsed it, and in that glimpse, he found an opportunity to serve. He was not a spy or a soldier or an intelligence officer. He was an electrician with good training, sharp eyes, and a sense of duty. In the end, that was enough. The cables he found led to a listening post. The listening post led to an investigation, and the investigation led to a significant counterintelligence success at a critical moment in American history. It was, in many ways, a very Cold War story, full of technical details and bureaucratic procedures, of careful observation and patient investigation. There were no dramatic shootouts or daring escapes, no glamorous spies or exotic locations, just an ordinary man doing his job well, noticing something wrong and reporting it to the right people. And yet, in its ordinariness, the story captured something essential about the Cold War, the way it penetrated into everyday life, the way it required constant vigilance from everyone, the way small discoveries could have large consequences. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.